spent 33 years here. I wrote over 10,000 stories, and I think what made Albany a great place to tell stories is that people are authentic. I found it a very human scale city, a very unpretentious city. People have, knowledge of 400 years of history in this city. It's also the state capital. There's a lot of great characters, and but I think it's a place where people will open up and tell your stories. It always amazes me as a reporter, you come up to a stranger, and 2 hours later they've told you their life story. It's a wonderful privilege.
Harry, how would you compare the storytelling here with, say, Washington, D.C., your posting before you arrived at the Times-Union?
Well, I think it's a good question that you ask, and I think each community exudes its own vibes, its own individuality, but I think I can go to Peekskill, New York. Have you heard of Peekskill? And find that an interesting place, or find the things about it that are interesting. And coming to Albany from Washington, after having spent many years in New York City journalism, I was not, it wasn't like I was taking a step down. I was taking a step into a different sort of universe. But it was a fascinating universe. It has a strong political history, which was ongoing when I got here. People have been writing about it for decades. Even this old guy here was writing about it, had written about it, and had given up and gone God knows where, someplace and where they had palm trees. Yeah, it had a colonial history. It was one of the first cities in colonial times to be established. It just abounds in history. Wherever you turn, wherever you look, there is some nook of it still preserved. And I think the people were justly proud of living here and comfortable living here. And it was a good place to be a newspaper person.
So, Bill, what about Albany? Why is Albany a storytelling venue?
Well, I want the microphone. Hello. Push the button. Hello. All right. Yep. I'm on.
You're on.
Well, I would separate the idea that Albany is automatically a great place to write novels or anything like that. Is this working?
Yeah.
But it's a great place to write nonfiction or journalism. I mean, this town abounds in superlatives through history. I mean, we've been the most boring city and the most for some people, but we've also had most recently our most recent superlative is Erastus Corning, who Paul wrote a wonderful book about, and he was our mayor for 43 years. I mean, 43 years, 11 consecutive terms. That he used to worry about. There was a mayor in somewhere in Illinois who had a 42-year term or 41-year term when he was turning 42, but he checked it out, and I think the fellow in Illinois was somewhere like 37 or 38. Yeah. I mean, he wasn't even close. I mean, this guy was mayor longer than Mao Zedong and Trujillo and Genghis Khan and Augustus Caesar and Corning. I told him about my findings on this, that he was in power longer than Augustus Caesar, and he said, yeah, but Augustus Caesar didn't smoke tobacco. And he died looking for breath. Anyway, the political thing is just endless to talk about, I mean, there's so much. When you go backward, the oldest city in the nation, the oldest chartered city. I mean, we were chartered in 16, whatever that date was. The Duncan Charter, and we became a city, and it's been I mean, Jefferson. Everything that you think about America, it's a lot of it happened in Franklin, Hamilton, the Schuyler's. It's a hugely rich tapestry of the ethnic groups that came to this country. I mean, the Irish. We were here. We were here before the Revolution. I mean, I think there was an Irishman on.
Weren't the Dutch here first?
I think there was one on Plymouth Rock, and there was certainly one on at the Thanksgiving dinner, and
His name was O. Van Skyke.
But there's great fantastic history of the building of the Erie Canal. I mean, that whole concept of trying to build a canal across the nation as the nation existed in those days. And then, Jefferson thought it was ridiculous to try and do it.
But not everybody, when you talk about politics, not everybody finds politics fascinating. I think, like, Harry, when you were trying to find somebody, talk about politics for a second. When you're trying to find somebody to write about politics, when you were an editor, trying to find somebody to cover the state capitol, I mean, I think as Bill says, you want those stories, but a lot of times you don't get real story, do you? You get what happened, not how. You don't get the full characterization. How do you cover politics to bring it to people?
How come you don't have a gun like I have?
Because I'm better than you are.
In what way?
Because I have this microphone.
Because he's the battling editor.
It is the job of journalism to report what's happening. It is the primary job of journalism to report what's happening. Now, if it gets to be good journalism, it describes how it happens. And if it even is better journalism, why it happens. But to report what is happening, especially in another time when you didn't have internet, when you didn't have TV, when you didn't have radio, was really an awesome responsibility, and was the connective tissue of this nation for most of its life. And so we shouldn't just say, knock it off, as if, what else did you do besides report? Report accurately, report honestly, and that's a day's work.
What do you think about the political journalism of Mr. Kennedy's friend Hunter S. Thompson, for example?
Well, that's a leading question coming my way. It's not entirely fair. I think that's very attractive. It creates a lot of stir and a huge following, but it's not my cup of tea. I believe our veracity depends upon our credibility, and that depends upon our honesty in doing our work, that we don't just let our ideas about what is happening dominate the facts of what is happening. It's good to have ideas, but it's not good to go cover the state or any other situation with preconceived notions. And I believe, I don't want to personalize it to Hunter alone, I believe those people are tended to think that their insights provide a superior insight to what was actually happening. Now, if you want to write that way, you should do that, but you should write a novel.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think probably, I've never written a novel. I wouldn't even dare attempt it. That's probably far more difficult than writing the kind of journalism I'm talking about. And what I'm talking about, believe me, is very hard to do.
Well, now, actually, that brings up a topic that we'll come back to this political thing, but at that moment, you bring up an interesting difference between nonfiction and fiction. In this book that I think is on sale tonight, Bootlegger of the Soul, at one point, Bill is quoted as saying about how it's hard to write journalism. It's hard to write fiction, both. And you say you learn craft, but creating out of nothing, which would be fiction, is still like building the Tower of Babel every day. You get up so high, but without a clue where it's going, and you'll never get to the top. So have you found fiction writing to be, which you've stuck with for many years now after leaving journalism, is it harder than doing journalism?
Is fiction harder than doing journalism?
Yeah.
Yes, it is, but... Yes, it is. But it didn't used to be. Fiction, writing journalism was the hardest thing I could do. When I first went to the Times-Union, I wasn't even sure. I mean, I had been a journalist since I was a sophomore in high school. And when I graduated from high school, I went to Siena and I insisted that I be on a newspaper or I wasn't going to go to the college. And so I was on the newspaper and I wrote a story before the school year started. I wrote a thing about a smoker, a baseball thing, and it was terrible. It was a terrible story, and it had to be rewritten. And it appeared in the first edition of the newspaper when school started, but I didn't recognize it. But that's okay. But I did it, and that was what I wanted. But it was so hard to do. Learning how to be a journalist. When I arrived. I got a job. I went 4 years, and I was a school editor to run the paper, and then I went a year as a sports writer up in Glens Falls, and then 2 years in the Army. I was another sports writer. I had my own Jeep covering. This was the Cold War. I wasn't exactly chilly in those days, but I had a cushy job I felt that when I came to the Times-Union in 1952, I wasn't sure I would ever recognize what a news story was. I was afraid I was going to miss it because I was so imbued with the idea of journalism being so deeply ingrained with the idea of accuracy and moral stringency, and I don't know what I was ingrained with, but I was worried sick. I wouldn't recognize a news story. Well, it turned out I did. I was able to recognize a few news stories, and I wrote it. But it was very tough. It was a tough thing to learn, and I felt that. And I don't think that there's a lot of newspapermen who do not learn it. There's a lot of newspapermen who just glide, and there were. I mean, they're a different kind of character from Harry or Paul or me. They were guys who were just moving through the days, writing stories in the same way they'd cut pork chops in the butcher shop or something. It was a different procedure for those guys.
You know, some of it is a discipline, I think. Paul, I was thinking of I've been thinking lately about a package that you did probably 20 years ago now, which I worked on with you, and I was managing editor of that explored the problem of the mentally ill in prison. And in New York State, Paul found there were a lot of mentally ill people who were kept in shoes, that is, single housing units, isolated 23 hours a day from contact with anybody else, which of course exacerbated their mental illness, according to your reporting.
Yeah, that was a great series. But can I jump in here with my origin story? Because I owe these two. I'm so honored to be on the stage for the first time in all the years I've been hanging around here with Bill and Harry, my two great mentors. Bill was the very first person I met on the campus of the University of Albany, Labor Day weekend in 1981. I came 4 days across country. I knew nobody. I got pretty lucky. He was the only one working on Labor Day weekend in the English department. And full disclosure, I never took a journalism class, so I work with a lot of journalism students. I say, you're already ahead of me, just keep working. And Harry Rosenfeld, after I got rejected at this paper and a few hundred other newspapers, took a chance on me in 1984 and was also a great mentor. So I owe a lot to what these two great newspapermen, but just great people taught me. There's so many people in this room. You know, I think I was good at observing and learning from really qualified and talented journalists. I'm seeing Carol DeMar here. I'm seeing Ron Kermani here. My great editor Rob Brill, Mike Spain. I could go on and on. People in this room who built this newspaper into a great newspaper under, we called him a bulldog in a bow tie. I mean, Harry was a tough editor, but we really got to the point where we would go through fire for Harry. I started on the night police desk. I sat next to scanners. Harry Haggerty was my first editor. I didn't know what I was doing. I'd go out to some horrible shooting, explosion, some tragedy, and I'd get to a payphone put quarters in the payphone and call back and try to dictate a story. And there's like, they called me college boy because I had a graduate degree in English, no journalism. It's like, college boy, just get the names and don't misspell anything, and easy on the metaphors and easy on the similes. And anyway, but I learned from great journalists, and you know, I just kind of kept progressing, and that series on the prisons was just one of many great opportunities I had here. So I have nothing but great respect for my colleagues in this newspaper and these two gentlemen that taught me so much about writing.
Very cool. What that series, what struck me about that was you bring a lot of literary technique to your newspaper writing, which many people do not. You know, many people just do a straight recording of facts. Part of it is the kind of story that you would gravitate toward as a reporter. And I will tell you that editing a Grondahl piece is almost impossible because it is so densely layered. I think, I'm just guessing about how you put these things together. I think you probably write and then find more in your notebook and weave it back into the story so that when you want to shorten a
No editor accused me of writing too short, that's for sure. I was always hoping I'd get paid by the word.
When you try to shorten it, you just don't. And so what you do is you end up asking for more space, right? You expand and make the newspaper a little bit larger to accommodate the fine reporting of Paul Grondahl. But I'm wondering about how, given the fact that you want to bring some writing style to the paper, convinced as you surely are that people will read more if there's good writing, does that ever interfere with the reporting that Harry is talking about, the real truth-telling that is fundamental?
So, yeah, I think the best writing needs both. It needs great reporting. I mean, the foundation has to be getting to turning over every stone, going down every pathway, finding out as much as you can, getting every interview subject, but then you have to be able to write with a narrative style, I feel, for long pieces. So that's what I tried to do. Rob Brill edited many of my stories. The other thing is, a couple things I tell young students: find a great mentor, like I was lucky, I've got two here, and find a great editor. And I had a lot of them at this newspaper, so it's always good to get a good editor. But yeah, I do like to layer, and I do, you know, really spend a lot of time with people. It's different now. It's much faster. You don't have as much time or space. Those are always the determining factors. How much time and how much space do you have? I mean, you give me enough time and space, I'll write a book. You give me an hour, it'll be a short story. So.
Well, I think that actually gets us into a little area that, Harry, really you explore in, especially in this second volume, the battling editor, and that is how much has changed now that you've witnessed in the world of journalism. Give us just a synopsis, if you would, of what you see that is different now in newsrooms and in the practice of journalism from what you were accustomed to, say, 30 years ago.
There's a vast difference. First of all, our numbers are much smaller. Our space is much less. What is asked of the reporter today is much more than was conventionally asked of reporters those decades ago. You're expected to work faster. You're expected to work with more authority, accuracy. And the backup systems aren't there because there are fewer editors. There's also the necessity to put your material out on the web way before it reaches print stage. And that is what the biggest change. When I was operating in newspapers for more than 50 years, you had a chance to have 4 or 5 different people take a look at a news story if the news story was worth it. Not every news story is worth it, but so you had so many different set of eyes that could catch not only errors, but speak to writing, speak to expression. How do you say this and how do you say that? But many of these people have been eliminated. I think it's much tougher to do a reporter's job today than it was in my day. And I marvel at the people who work so hard and accomplish so much. At the same time, that the internet, which has brought us all these marvels, has also caused a lot of destruction to us in our business, but also to our society and to our politics, as we can see every day. And so we have a tiger by the tail that's not going to go away. If anything, it's going to eat us up. And we face enormous issues about how we function in this society, holding on to the values, the distilled values that have come down to us from the past. And I am not a pessimistic person at this stage. I don't know how the story ends. I'd like to know how it ends. But I am concerned. I think you should be too.
There's something there that Harry said before, and that you mentioned about Hunter Thompson. This whole idea of time, like time is run out on daily journalism because it's no longer daily. It's like Harry said, you don't have a day. You got about a couple of minutes, and everybody has to get this off immediately. And so, what is the survival quality that will make newspapers transcend this and become absolutely irreplaceable? And it became, I think, opinion and. I'm not going to fight you. I'm not saying that that the objective journalism is wrong. I'll get to it. I got a point. But Hunter Thompson is a good handle on it. I mean, Hunter Thompson just went out, and Hunter Thompson probably is more the inventor of fake news than Donald Trump. Hunter was a supreme inventor of the news. Whatever he covered, he reinvented it. And I mean, he just had Walter Cronkite as a white slaver, and he had Ed Muskie as injecting ibogaine from some. But what he was interpolating and what he was presenting to this country when he was writing these things was a point of view that was so different and so away from this objective idea of journalism that it was welcomed universally. I mean, everybody loved those stories. And Hunter, I think, was writing fiction. I've said this over and over again, and it's not journalism. It's a fictional hybrid of journalistic coverage, but how many guys have been doing that ever since? I mean, we're overflowing with the new journalism came in. They started using fictional devices. Started using dialogue and even point of view. If they had asked enough questions, they could get away with it. It was different. It wasn't acceptable by Harry's standards or my standards in those days. It was something different. And I think that this is where we are now. I mean, there's no going back. I mean, the traffic on the internet in news and whatever happens is so fast and so instantaneous now. I mean, it's you know, you used to have a 15-minute beat for the UP beat the Associated Press on a scoop about the signing of the armistice, the surrender of Germany. But if it wasn't a grip on the absolute perfection of the news story before it goes into print, it was just a wild venture into the future. And it became another way of delivering the news, and that's what we're living with right now. I think that there's a lot of that going on.
Your point about is interesting. That opinion then you think is propelling forward. Is opinion the salvation for
that
journalism?
Seems to me to be the only thing, because there's no way to keep up with the time that will get the objective fact out there, the objective story out there. In time, it'll be beaten by somebody who invents it faster.
What do you think about that?
I'm not against opinion in a newspaper, but if you're going to have an opinion, then call it an opinion. Don't call it a news story. I agree with much of what Bill says, but I disagree on the remedy. I think the remedy is to bring the stringencies of traditional journalism to analysis, to do enterprise stories, to do investigative stories. That's the salvation. Now we have to do the Who Struck John stories because they are bread and butter. So we have to tell you what's happening at City Hall and what's happening in the State House and so forth. That's a basic obligation. But what would make us essential is a vibrant editorial page, for example, where this is all opinion. And if it's a terrific editorial page, it'll have a terrific op-ed page of mixed opinion to show people that you're going to have vastly different opinions about the same issue. But the heart of the newspaper should be dynamic enterprise reporting, turning over stones, opening up doors that were shut, exposing wrongdoing. But doing it factually, not because you think this guy is a real bad person, but because you can show that this person is bad. And here are the facts. Now, it's not biblical truth, It's only today's version of the truth that we've been able to find. Because as we do our work, I know it's hard to believe, people don't tell us the truth. They have no interest in telling us the truth if it reflects badly on them. They want to tell you, they want to be like advertisers. They want to promote themselves. And one of the big skills that a journalist requires is the discernment to see this is a promotional truth or this is a factual truth. That's where the rubber hits the road. That's where the difficulty lies. We have not been the bearer of breaking news, which is so famously now the grist of the mill on TV, for a long, long time. It didn't end with radio, but it began to end with radio. And then TV came along, and that accelerated the process. We're not telling people the first thing about the news most times. So we can tell them, how did this news happen? How does it fit into context? And this is a much harder job to do. It takes you have to accumulate a lot of information, and you have to know how to judge that information.
Yes, that's
And
the key.
that's not what Hunter did. Hunter applies his imagination, and he applies. You can have that if you want it in your newspaper. I wouldn't have it in my newspaper, because in my newspaper, even though I made all the efforts in the world, enough fiction crept in. I didn't need to have any creative fiction.
But listen, I think that, since Trump came in and this whole fake news business, I think that the Times and the Washington Post, which I read cover to cover every day, both newspapers, I think that they are just doing such superb journalism right now that and that I think it's of a different order, and I think that their mandate in wherever they're getting their mandate from is to do exactly what you just said, is the investigation, and I think they're more rigorous now in not having fanciful fake news or fantasy news that Hunter might bring. But Hunter, he's something else. He just brings a point of view which nobody else has, which is really interesting. But the Times and the Wall Street Journal, it seems, and the Washington Post, I mean, they're doing fantastic things.
I agree.
Every day. I mean, and there's a couple of stories today. I mean, it's just, I think it's monumental. I think that the objective kind of journalism that you and I started out with and still believe in is richer and more important than ever. But there is a point of view coming through everything. And we're ranging back to the way we were in the 19th century, when there was a Democratic newspaper and a Republican newspaper. There was a same that existed in Jefferson's time and Lincoln's time, and Teddy Roosevelt sued the Republican boss who ran the Albany Evening Journal. And won. He didn't sue. He said the boss was corrupt, and the boss sued the president, and the president won. And that was the way partisan journalism was throughout the 19th century, early 20th century. And then we had this middle of the 20th century where there was this, this rage for objectivity and rage for simple language also, which
that's another 18
story.
words per
But
second.
that's faded. Now something else is happening now, and we're in a grip of a new kind of. I mean, just think about the way Fox News is juxtaposed to MSNBC. MSNBC, you get from 4 o'clock in the afternoon until midnight. You get one wave of left, center, Democratic, anti-Trump reporting. I mean, you get the straight news. Those guys are really good reporters. On Fox News, you get the all day long the same thing, pro-Trump. But they're both out there as major sources of news, and they are presenting themselves in exactly the same way that those newspapers in the 19th century did. They're presenting a point of view with the news. I mean, you get the news. You know who's getting
Not
going
always.
to jail.
You don't
but,
always get the news. The selection of stories actually is on those television networks is often precludes truth because you're only getting a piece of it. You're not really getting all the news. The story selection on the cable news outlets actually limits your news consumption. So what you're saying is that the interpretive reporting that is in the best tradition of journalism that's being represented by the Washington Post and the New York Times these days on the national level is spectacular, and it is a higher quality of journalism than we have seen before. I think that's true. Why then, and what are we to do about the fact that journalism is in such disrepute? How do we confront that?
I think we end up getting the media that we deserve, just like we get the government we deserve if we're not engaged and working at it. It's really easy just to flip on Facebook and whatever washes across you read, which is tied to an algorithm to give you your echo chamber. So I'm a dinosaur like Bill. I read 3 newspapers in print every day, Times Union, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, and spend 1 to 2 hours. And on Sundays, like 3 hours plus of the New York Times, when it's still a great paper every Sunday, an amazing paper. But that takes a lot of effort. If you're only going to put in a few minutes, whatever washes across your feed, or watch a couple videos, then you're not going to be informed. It does take time, it takes effort, but it's still available. The problem is getting lazy consumers and lazy readers to put that time in every day.
Well, I think that's true. Great journalism will survive, I think, only if there's an audience that can recognize it. And I'm concerned that we are raising generations now of people who don't recognize great journalism and who don't appreciate it or find a place. Find a place for it in their lives. So how do we do that? I don't think very many people in America, certainly not the great masses of people who consumed journalism when there were 15 newspapers in New York City, I don't think very many people are consuming news the way you're talking about. How do we get people to care about the news then?
Well, it depends. You have to decide what you're going to be. Are you going to be a New Republic and publish it daily? Good luck to that. Or are you going to be a paper that brings information to its readers that is important for the readers to have? Now, that doesn't mean you should not write well. That doesn't mean you should not write with style. I think you should encourage that, and you should teach that if to the extent possible. You should mentor that, whatever that is, and reward it. But it has to be fact-based. It has to be honest. It should not be advocacy off the editorial page. It should be analytical, but mostly it should be informative. Now, if they don't want to buy that, then too bad for us. But I think that's our only solution. And I would disagree with Bill's recital of history. I have a different view of it. I think when TV began to dominate the news, it improved journalism, the big city journalism to begin with, because the newspapers had to do something different. They couldn't say President de Gaulle said yesterday that, because people already knew, if they were interested, what President de Gaulle said yesterday. So you have to say, if it's a news story important to your readership, what he was saying, what was the context of what he was saying, where did it come from, what problem was it meant to be solved, as your first day's presentation, weaving in all the facts of what de Gaulle actually said. And I think that's the way we maintain our credibility, and no matter how much abuse is heaped on us. And I don't know if there's another way. I would love to hear it, but I don't think it is unleashing creative writing on an audience as a substitute. I remember vividly, it's seared into my soul, there was an article published by Rolling Stone, an avant-garde magazine where Hunter was very much published, right? They took on a very important issue, sexual harassment on campus. And they identified it. There was good insight. This was something that we need to do something about. And one way or another, they found a woman who said she was raped by 7 fraternity boys. And they said, this story, above all, will illustrate, encapsulate the problem, and have the shock value to wake people up to what is happening and needs to come to a full stop. So they printed the story without properly vetting it, and it turned out to be a total lie from beginning to end, revealed by other journalists working for other organizations that then went over the allegations and found to be untruthful. That devastated Rolling Stone, and I think rightly so. This is not what you should do. You shouldn't play with people's trust, with people's support. They should know every day that the best effort, has stringent, tough effort has gone into it to present the best, most accurate information possible. That doesn't mean it's all divine truth. It is not. It is limited truth. It is the truth that we've been able to learn. Tomorrow we'll learn some more. The day after some more. But each ingredient, each installment has got to be honest and not pretentious to some other literary value, as great as that might be, but that's not how a newspaper should operate.
I think seems to me that what the newspapers are doing well right now, I don't know for sure, but it seems the Times is adapting to the new world, and they've got, I mean, their online presentation has improved enormously. I mean, they're staying, I don't think they stay abreast of like minute by minute the changes in the news. They don't seem to do that yet, but I don't know if they ever have to. But they've changed the way they cover things. They've changed what they cover, and I think that they're growing. It seems to me. Now, whether they're going to continue to grow, or whether the Times Union is going to continue to grow, if the Times Union does the same thing, and the Washington Post seems to be doing the same thing, and the Wall Street Journal, but I mean, there's so much competition out there. It's hard to say who's going to cross the finish line and who isn't, but. That certainly is one of the ways. I mean, it's to change and become a different kind of messenger. Mm-hmm. That you're dealing with the moment. You're dealing with the subject matter that you would never think about, and you're also there's so many pieces in the Times now which are full of opinion, points of view of so many columnists. I don't know half of them anymore, but some of the great ones are still there, Paul it's a dynamic moment, I think, for that newspaper, and I think it's really making headway.
It is. There are two national publications in the United States, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and so they are able to make money digitally. And there is, and the Washington Post is owned by the richest man in the world. So you have singled out three publications that do have unusual positions across the country. The rest of us have different roles to play, and meeting the margin requirements. Toward the end of Harry's new volume, it says that he talks about the constant struggle through your career was to maintain journalistic integrity in the face of management's frequent indifference, if not hostility. I think in some places, I hasten to say that is not the case with my publisher. I'm a very lucky editor these days. But still, in many places, the difficulty, we're not immune to the difficulties of trying to meet the profit requirements to keep the place running, to keep the lights on in a different era. So I think it is terrific the great journalism that those three newspapers are turning out, but it is a much more difficult problem for every place from Albany to Zanesville, Ohio. I'm just trying to find some place with a Z in it. And we're all then trying to find the right place, what the right formula might be.
But I still, this used to be the morgue. We called it the morgue, all the clips, tons and tons of newspaper clips. And I loved spending time in the morgue because I liked writing stories about history. And I'd be digging around there. Every now and then I'd pull out a nugget and I'd start reading. It's like, this language just crackles. It's got a style. It moves on the page. And it was a byline of William Kennedy.
Yeah.
And so good writing will always draw me to the paper. I think Chris Churchill is one of the best columnists we've had here at the Times-Union in 35 years I've been around here. Amy Bincoli, I'll read anything she writes. Steve Barnes. There's still some great storytellers and narrative journalists here, and to me, that's always worth the price of admission.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Which is not to say that they don't elicit. I had a lot of criticism. I had a lunch with a politician today who took me to task for one of those people you're referring to. It's just a part of the job, right, Harry? Well, so to think for a little bit. So let's go back just for a moment here to your first newspaper job, each of you. Tell me a favorite story that you might have from that era. Think about what you were covering, or Harry, Harry started at the top. He started as an editor, so this is interesting.
That's a lie.
Well, started as a copy boy. It's almost
No, I started as a shipping clerk.
shipping clerk.
A shipping clerk.
Huh.
And it was my first job in the newspaper business. I had just graduated high school. It was January 1948, and I wasn't off to college till September. So I had to find some work. I'd been reading the Herald Tribune at my high school. I was required to take a New York City paper. That's the way they did it in the high school. They ordered you to do that, and you did it. And everybody wanted to. They wanted, or they were encouraged to take the New York Times. So I took the New York Herald Tribune instead, and I fell in love with it. And by the time I graduated high school, I was acquainted with the Herald Tribune, and I knew I wanted to be a newspaperman. So I thought I'd try the Herald Tribune for a job. I walked into their office, their personnel office, and I asked for a copyboard job, which I had learned was the way to go. Well, they had no copyboard jobs. They were just fresh out of them. But they did have an opening as the shipping clerk in the syndicate of the Herald Tribune. The syndicate took the material produced by the Herald Tribune and then sold it to other newspapers in the country and abroad to make up for the monies that they had to spend to accumulate this material in the first place. And so I began my career as a shipping clerk. I am embarrassed to have to say that as an editor all these years later. I didn't begin as a copy boy. And the first instrument that I used, the first machine that I used that was new to me was a mimeograph machine. But I learned how to manipulate a mimeograph machine, and in my day I was pretty good at it. And the second device that I managed to master, I found in the composing room, because I would have to go into the composing room, which was in those days was jammed with people working all day long, to get proofs pulled to mail out the bridge column, this column, that column, the other column, and also to get the matrices from which the comic strips had been embedded by a stereotyper. They crushed these into paper mache mats, but then there was always an overage at the edges, and they had this fierce-looking blade there, and you had to chop off, and I became very adept at that. That's where I learned how to chop. So that's
Betty
how
was the battling shipping clerk.
Well, that's where I learned, and because I was working for the syndicate, which they sold everything that could possibly sell, the crossword puzzle, the editorial cartoon, the comic strips, all the columnists, Crosby and Walter Lippmann and the Alsop brothers, the food coverage, the fashion coverage. So I was running throughout the building all day long, picking up here, delivering there. But I got to know the people in those places, and I got to see how they related to each other and how everything came together for the newspaper. It was an invaluable experience, and I never, in my subsequent 50 years of work in newspapers, knew a newspaper as well as I knew the New York Herald Tribune. So I know that was not the answer you were looking for.
It was a good story
and I'm delighted
anyway.
to give it to you.
That was pretty good. Bill, tell us what story did you report early on that you think was like a great story that kind of bit you and convinced you wanted to be a reporter? Grab your microphone there, please.
I want to. I want to join Harry in eulogizing the Herald Tribune. I was reading the Herald Tribune in college, and especially for Red Smith, the sports writer. He was one of the greatest writers in journalism, whether on any page of the paper. But there was also, John Crosby was writing television, and Marguerite Higgins was over in Korea, and Homer Bigart was covering the war, and there were so many people. Walter Lippmann. It was a great, great newspaper, and I was so sad when it died in the 60s. 70s? 60s. 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 But I subscribed to it when I was drafted, and it followed me wherever I went in the Army. I used to get 32 Herald Tribunes all at once when I was in Germany. And I also got 32 copies of the Glens Falls Post-Star, which was my first newspaper job. I was a sports writer up there. And so I don't know what the first story was that I had a column. I had a column in college. I always wanted to be a columnist. I wanted to be Damon Runyon. I wanted to be Haywood Broun, and I wanted to. I had a lot to say, I thought, even though I didn't know what I was saying, and but it didn't bother me, and so I wrote this column, and then when I went in the Army, I wrote a column back for. Constantly to the Post-Star, and they paid me $3 a column.
Oh, wow.
And man, that added up. I mean, I had about $70 or something, maybe 60, when I got out of the Army that I could put toward a car. But but I could write anything I wanted, and I got my. I'll tell you the story. The story when I went in the Army, as writing I called it This New Army, and I was imitating what I remembered of what's his name? There was a guy in the World War II who was
Ernie Pyle?
Oh,
Ernie Pyle?
no, he was a genuine war reporter. This was a guy who was a GI, and he wrote. I'll think of it. Anyway, it was supposedly whatever was happening. To me, I felt that's the way I could write it back and send it to. So I wrote back how bad the food was at Fort Devens in our first stop after we left Albany, and then something about a stupid sergeant somewhere in Fort Benning, and then I wrote a column. We were out doing marching, and the general came down, Harlan N. Hartness, our general, and one-star general. We were the 4th Division, the 1st Division to go overseas after the war, and we went to Germany. We thought we were going to Korea, but we didn't. And so Harlan Hartness came down, and he was watching us walk up and down, and I was out of step. And he said something to me. He'd say, "Hey, soldier, hey, what's it?" And I put this in, it was a funny paragraph. I don't remember. It's not funny now, but you got to take my word for it. It was a funny paragraph. And so I was a company clerk in Company H in the 4th Division, the 8th Regiment, and I could type. That's why I got the job. And so I got a call one day, and company clerk, and they said, "I'm looking for recruit Kennedy." And I said, "That's speaking, sir. This is recruit William Kennedy." He said, "Well, Kennedy, that was a very good column you wrote in the Glens Falls Post-Star the other day about the general." And I said, "Well, thank you, sir, thank you." And he said, "Don't write any more." So I said, "Oh, what?" He said, "But come on up and see me, and maybe I'll give you a job." And what this was, we were in basic training, and that was, I don't know, 12 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, I don't know how long, I can't remember. And when it was all over, you went through the line, and they sent you into ordnance or whatever and I said I got a chance to go to PIO, public information, and they said, "Yeah, but don't worry about it." And then they were sending me to some I think it was ordnance. I was going to wind up in ordnance, and but I called the major back. This was Major Zimmerman, and he had been a newspaper man in a certain way. He had been an advertising salesman at the Hackensack Record for real estate advertising, and he was running the PIO. I went up to see him, and he put the papers through it. He got me. He brought me up. And I wound up with about 7 or 8 other guys who came from Oklahoma, and Brooklyn, Mississippi, Indiana, California. I mean, these guys were all newspaper guys. And some of them were writers. One of them was writing a movie, and the other guy was trying to write a novel, and we had, a section, so it was, and we stuck together, from Benning to New York and then to Frankfurt, Germany, and we were together for something like 18, 20 months. And anyway, I got to stop talking. Anyway, that was the story about the colonel was got me my job.
Inadvertently. Paul, what great story did you get from the beginning from your career?
I came here to be interviewed in 1984, having been rejected one time. This guy was very intimidating. I had to imagine suspenders, shirt off, sleeves rolled up, bow tie, gruff voice. I came in like I thought I had no shot. He sat me down, kind of grilled me for a minute. And then the last question, I think this clinched it. He said, "We need someone for the softball team. Can you play second base?" I said, "I got decent second base," so I think that sealed it. But you can't really be prepared for being on Night Cops. I was probably 2 weeks into it, and I'd already seen my share of tragedy. And there was a call that came over the scanner, car accident, Hoosick Falls, way out near Hoosick Falls, Route 2. And I got out there on the scene, and it was a convertible. It was a young woman. I think she was 19 or 20. She was speeding, probably 70 miles an hour. She had 9 young nieces, nephews in the car, and she hit a tree head on. And they were picking up children 20, 30, 40 yards away. And it doesn't matter if you took a journalism class in that scene or if you come from a literature background. I mean, I'm getting choked up thinking about it. This is what you see as a newspaper reporter. And the first thing you need to bring to the job is empathy and humanity. And stories like that change you. You realize like anyone's life can change in an instant like that. But there were so many stories like that. You see people kind of at their best and worst. I preferred to write about people at their best, but I saw a lot of people at their worst, and that was, I mean, imagine that day for that family, and just trying to capture that raw emotion of that scene was, that job changes you.
So we need to wrap it up so that you can buy books and have them signed over here. And just by way of, I'm going to ask another question up here, but just by way of explanation, what's going to happen is there are book sales in the area out behind that door, and then you'll be brought around through here so that you can go around to that table where the authors will be sitting. But if you will, when the time is right, you'll go out the big doors out here, and you'll be directed toward the area over there. You'll see once you go out the doors. And so we invite you to do that too. They make great Christmas presents, these books that you can buy. And we're grateful to the folks at Bookhouse, thank you. The Bookhouse at Stuyvesant Plaza for coming in. Also, by the way, for those of you who are interested in a little more conversation of this, on the evening of January the 16th, Mr. Rosenfeld and I will be speaking at the College of St. Rose. That is, we'll be sitting down together. We'll be speaking in the sense that I'm going to be the interlocutor interviewing Harry about his book, his thoughts about journalism today. We've done a couple of conversations like this before. Once on the topic of Watergate on the 40th anniversary, was it? Something like that.
That was when Mark Felt revealed himself.
When Mark Felt revealed himself to be Deep Throat. Once when Volume 1, Kristallnacht to Watergate, came out, and we'll do this again and talk a little more about the Albany years. So be sure to do that, though I don't know that they will have Hearst Ranch wine the way we do tonight. So thank you to George, by the way, for that. So just to wrap up, the Code of Ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists, the top tenet, which we have painted on the conference room wall in here, says, seek the truth and report it as fully as possible. Seek the truth and report it as fully as possible. And I wonder if you could just give me in a few words, each of you, a sense of how you think American journalism is doing toward that charge, and what you think needs to be done to hove to that high standard. How do we do a better job of seeking the truth and reporting it as fully as possible? What's the code here?
Well, I think I've answered your question during the course of the evening, I believe wholeheartedly that we must stick to our mission. We must report fearlessly. We must be as brainy as we can to figure out where the story lies, and to sort out the unwanted stuff from the pepper. There's another way of saying that.
You used it in your book.
Yes, I did. I
the
didn't want
actual
to
word.
embarrass some gentleman here. So, I feel that the reporting today is as marvelous for many reasons. It's competitive, which is good. It isn't only competitive among publications, but the internet often has good reporting coming out of it. But also, ladies and gentlemen, I've lived through many administrations, and this is the leakiest White House I have ever imagined. And as a former national editor in Washington, I got to tell you, I'm sorry, I'm not there now. I mean, all of the wasted energy in Watergate, my God, and all the false trails and whatnot. So you have to be alert. You have to know when it's coming your way. You have to have good contacts. Stick to your mission. Do good work. It'll be its own reward.
Okay. Mr. Kennedy, seek the truth and report it as fully as possible. What do you think people need to do?
Seek the truth. Well, I think that I feel it more than I know it, but I feel that what newspapermen in these newspapers that are under siege now, all newspapers are under siege, I think that they're trying more and more to to be absolutely, impeccably accurate. Four sources. This is not what it was in the old days. If you had one source, it was great. If you had the story, you thought you had the story. I mean, then it became you had to have two, and then so on. But this is great, and I think that pressure, that fake news pressure that he keeps putting on the press, enemy of the people, is just making newspaper people more aware of how valuable they are and how important the free press and the accurate press, the objective press, the true press is in this country and everywhere. And I mean, the cover of Time magazine is all about the press today. I got it in the mail, and it's Khashoggi and the newspaper that was attacked in the South, and journalists who were killed and kidnapped and so on. It's horrible, and our president is just supporting it, hand over hand. Anyway, I think that this is a really difficult and really important time for the individual newspaper man, that he can't make a slip anymore. He can't. When we find out that the Times was wrong on a story, that's a disaster, because it's terrible. We know that they're trying all the time. I mean, this is the nature of the game. This is what you enter into, thinking that you have to be accurate. You can't come forth with fake news or a fake fact. And I don't remember in my days at the Times Union. I I don't remember anybody making up stories like Ben Heck did, or he had a runaway trolley car one day down some state street in Chicago and wherever it was, and there was no runaway trolley. It was just an invention for a slow news day, and Mencken did the same thing when he was a kid reporter on the Baltimore Sun. He used to make up this invader who could come into a neighborhood and ravage a house or something, or burn down a barn or whatever, and totally imaginary character. That they just did it for kicks. But I don't remember any of that at the Times Union. I remember a lot of bad journalism. I mean, killing stories on the behalf of the politicians and making sure the politicians had the great. One story was John McGuire wrote an obituary of Dan O'Connell. And Dan O'Connell was the boss of Albany. And John had gotten a lot of background on the fact that Dan did some time in the 20s for contempt of court, and he was questioned about the baseball pool, which they were making millions on. And Dan went into hiding, and he was disappeared. He couldn't. Finally, they got him, and he came to court, and he refused to talk. "I'm vague on that," was his answer. "I'm vague on that." And so for his behavior, he got 6 months, a year. I don't know how long. And he went to New York, and he was in a jail in New York, and. And there was a guy named Charlie Ryan, who was a broker, Wall Street broker, and he knew Dan very well, and he would make sure that Dan was picked up at 9 o'clock in the morning at the jail and carried by car up to his house in Washington Heights or wherever he lived, and spent the day there, and then would have a car at 9 o'clock at night or 8 o'clock at night to take him back to jail and check in, and he'd sleep in the jail and go back and forth, and so anyway, that sort of behavior was in the obit. That I don't remember exactly what it was, but then Dan got sick, and they went to get the obit to get it ready for print, and it was gone. There was no obit, and then they began to wonder why there was no obit. And they realized there were people, reporters on the paper, who were in the pay of the political machine. The guys who were covering City Hall, the guys who were covering the courts, guys who were covering the police beat. So they wrote another obit. And they put it away. And then when they checked it out about 2 weeks later, it was gone again. So they wrote a third obit, and then they filed it under environmental intrusion of the chemicals. I've forgotten exactly what it was, but it stayed there. And when Dan died, they found the obit and used it, and it did have some of those salacious details. But it was anyway.
A different era. newspaper.
That was definitely a different era. That was, but that was the era I worked in when I first came there. That was the kind of newspaper it was in those days. A lot of guys were on the payroll, and they were in thrall to the machine. It was a most interesting machine, and there were some great people in it, and some great people here tonight who were part of it.
So the man who wrote about it, Mr. Grondahl. Yes, last words.
First of all, I just want to thank the Writers Institute. My team was here working hard all night. We're proud to be a co-sponsor. We had an amazing symposium a year ago last fall called Telling the Truth in a Post-Truth World. We spent 6 sessions, 90 minutes each, getting at these questions. And, you know, it takes a lot, and it's a really important conversation. But I also am really happy that I had a great home here at the Times Union. I have a great home now at the University of Albany. Our president, Avidan Rodriguez, and his wife, Rosie Lopez, who come to a lot of our events and support us. And I think it's a matter of don't lose your confidence. Remember who you are. I mean, here, Bill worked at all 3 plants, Beaver Street, Sheridan Avenue, and this plant. Through the course of the history, we've got legends right here, and believe in what they're saying. I think it's a matter of the business model. I think it's got to be a not-for-profit or philanthropy or something. And my final prescription, and I know this will work, hire more reporters and give them a raise, the ones who are here.
All right. I think we'd all agree on that one. Wonderful. So, thank you all for coming.
Rex,
Yeah.
I remembered where they filed it. It was under, the obit was filed under air pollution.
Excellent. Bill Kennedy, Paul Grondahl, Harry Rosenfeld, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you all for coming.